Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, good evening. Welcome to another public debate organized by the Prague Center for Middle East Relations of Cevro Institute. My name is Tomáš Kaválek. I am the director of the said center, and I will be today's moderator. The topic of today's debate is Iraq after elections, between resilient status quo and drivers of change. As the title of course suggests, we will discuss early Iraqi elections that were held last month on October 10. We are going to look into their results, winners and losers, the ongoing dynamics of government formation, and also the surprises that the elections brought. In a way, they were unique in several ways. They were early elections for the first time in modern Iraqi history, elections that came upon one of the main demands of the protest movement that started in October 2019. They were also held under brand new electoral system, which mixed up the results or affected the results in a significant way as political parties tried to adapt to it. Our distinguished guest tonight is Hiva Osman. He is an award-winning Iraqi Kurdish journalist, analyst, and commentator. He also served as a media advisor of the late Iraqi president, Jalal Talabani, in 2005 to 2008. He's leading commentator and analyst on the politics and media of Kurdistan region and Iraq as a whole. He's often quoted by the media about Iraq and larger Kurdish affairs in the Middle East. Also, as you can see in our slideshow, we are having some hot pictures just from the election days that were kindly provided by my friends Jarmila and Andrej Štukovi, who were covering the elections and provided these nice shots from the election days. Please make a note that the current epidemiological measures apply to this event. First and foremost, please wear your face masks for the whole duration of the event. Also, you have to have either negative PCR test no longer than 72 hours, negative antigen test no older than 24 hours, or have a proof of having COVID no longer than 180 days ago, or have at least 14 days from your finished vaccination. Thank you very much for adhering to these measures, which make it possible for us to have events on site and not webinars all the time, which I'm sure that we all had enough of that in the past year and a half. Now, Hiva will have his opening statement for around 40 minutes, and after that we will give space to you, the audience, to ask your questions. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for your presence. To be honest, I'm surprised, given the pandemic and the rising numbers, that this number of people attended. Well, I have to say thank you. And it is an indication of interest in Iraq, which is very heartening from an important country like the Czech Republic to see this audience at this time. It's very encouraging for people inside Iraq to see this interest in the country. I will try and be as brief as I can, although the Iraqi story can be very long, very detailed, but I don't want to bore you with the details. I will give an overview of the background that led to the election and the way the elections were conducted, and then moving on to today's election blocks mathematically and politically. It is a complicated picture. in the country, and it started this new turning point in Iraqi politics, started in 2019 on October 1st, when the protests started in Baghdad, beginning in Baghdad, and then it grew to the rest of the country. I remember on October 1st, I was in Baghdad on a different job. I was doing something else, and when we heard about the protests, and shortly after that, we heard about shooting by the government forces and by the anti-riot police shooting the protesters. To be honest, we did not believe it at the beginning until we went there ourselves. It was me and a friend of mine who was a camera person, and we went amongst the people to see what they want. Why are they on the street? And numbers were very large. It was the second day. The first day, all expectations were it will be yet like any other Friday. On Fridays in Tahrir Square, we would have many demonstrations in the past, but this time round, the numbers were larger, and the protesters were younger, and the reaction of the authorities was very strong to them. They did three things. First thing, they started shooting directly at the protesters. The second thing they did, they cut the internet. The third thing, they declared curfew. All three measures contributed to making the protests bigger and bigger. And what made the protests different this time was that the majority of the protesters were from the Shia community. And the authority in Iraq were also from the Shia. The power practically was held by political parties from the Shia community, despite the talk of having a mixed government. But in reality, power was in their hand. They were the ultimate decision makers in the affairs of the country. And the situation in the center and south of the country, in terms of services, in terms of economic situation, in terms of health, education, in every way, it was quite, what's the word, quite underdeveloped compared to the rest of the country. So the uprising of the people was a very natural consequence that we saw. By starting to kill the protesters, more people joined the protests, mostly from the tribes. If you are a tribe member and you get one of your members shot, then cousins and relatives and other members also go to the same scene to see what's going on, or to at least take part or to continue what their deceased member started. After that, the second step that contributed to the increase of the protests was cutting the internet. They shut down the internet, and that led to so many digital online activists who were at home following the events in Tahrir Square on their Facebook pages and Instagram and Twitter. They couldn't get the news anymore. So their contribution stopped being commenting, liking, or sharing. They went to the street to see what's going on. They decided to go for themselves to see what's going on. Here came the third measure, the curfew. By declaring a curfew, i.e. banning people from moving between areas, spread the protest everywhere. And in every neighborhood of Baghdad, you would find people coming out in the neighborhoods, and the police and the army and the PMF, the militias, were trying to stop them. They couldn't, so almost practically things got out of hand. After a few days, the then Iranian commander of the IRCG, Qasem Soleimani, came to Baghdad a few days later, and they instituted very strong measures to stop the protests, but it was becoming worse. With every measure, the demands of the protesters were becoming more, and they were becoming more and more difficult to stop. One of the key demands, or the most common slogan by all the protesters, and we are talking about a month into the protests now, in all parts of the country, from, center and south, in Baghdad, in Najaf, in Karbala, in Basra, in Hilla, everywhere else, was one slogan: Iran, barra barra, means out with Iran. They rejected and refused the Iranian influence in Iraq, and maybe control more than influence. Many of the political parties that were controlling the political scene, either in parliament or in the armed forces or in government, had connections with Iran. And they were not shying away from saying that. They were very open in saying, we believe in the Iranian brand of governance, and we should have a leader like that of Iran, or although they regarded Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, as their leader as well. So that led to an even more complicated setup. Marja'iyya, a Grand Ayatollah Sistani in Najaf, he stepped in, and then for the first time in quite some time in Iraqi history, the Friday sermon that was out of Najaf and Karbala in the name of Marja'iyya. Marja'iyya is the highest source of authority for the Iraqi Shiites. They started to have political speeches in their Friday sermons. And so every week, every Friday, politicians and protesters would wait for the Friday sermon and to see the messages. And every week it was almost like gambling betting between the protesters and the government. Whose side is the Marja'iyya going to be this week? Is it on the protesters' side or the government side? Until we heard a strong statement criticizing the government. The government back then, the Prime Minister was Adel Abdul Mahdi, and he took it as a clear message of asking him to leave, to step down. He stepped down, and the process, we started a new process that led to appointing, after a few failed names for the position of the Prime Minister, we had the current Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who was also the director of the intelligence services in Iraq. He was appointed as Prime Minister, and his appointment came in after the agreement of all the Shia blocs in parliament to go for him as the compromise candidate. And one of the key things he promised was to conduct an early election. Initially, the election was supposed to take place in June 2021, but then the commission, the new commission, said that we cannot hold it on time, and they said it has to be done in October, for technical reasons, of course. Going to the election, and as parallel to the process of appointing the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, the Parliament issued a few, again, quick and rushed decisions. The first thing was to decided also on an early election. They changed the Electoral Law. Previously, the law divided Iraq into 18 constituencies. Each governorate in Iraq was a constituency. This new law changed the country into 83 smaller constituencies. And in every constituency, you had 3 or 4 candidates to reach 3 or 4 winners or MPs to reach parliament. And the system was quite different this time. In the past, we had applied various formulas to candidates who were running in the election. We had lists, and if a list wins the amount of 4 seats, then 4 members of that list can make it to the parliament. And there was a lot of complaint that this system was not representative because we had situations, for example, the list of Maliki. He won something like 300,000 to 400,000 votes, and that's enough for 10 or 20 seats in parliament. But the 19 other MPs who made it to the parliament, the maximum of them would be getting 2,000 or 3,000 votes. And he gave his votes to the rest. And people did not regard this as a representative system. So in the change of the law this time, they went for what is called SNTV, single non-transferable vote. So for example, in a district, if Tomasz and I run in an election and I win, the votes I get will stay with me. But if he loses, his votes won't go to the others. This is how they looked at it in the previous system. So we had a new law, a new administrative system, district or division, and with the new law, we had a new commission, electoral commission. The previous commission were members or appointed by various political parties. So they were not really independent. The argument back then was, we will have a group of people, each one of them represents an interest, a political interest, so they can balance each other out. But in reality, they provided the cover for the parties to do whatever they want in their given areas. With the new commission, we had 9 judges. Mostly they were people who are known to be independent. They didn't have anything to do with politics. And they looked at the electoral process as a pure technical matter, as a technical procedure. And as a result, it involved various steps. One of the key steps that happened was to digitize the whole system, from voter registration to ballots, to biometric data during voter registration, and to using of fingerprints during voting, so that they make sure you don't vote twice or 3 times. These irregularities happened in the past, in the previous elections, in 2018, 14, 10, and 2006. There were many complaints that there were rigging of the elections. Some areas, the ballot boxes were much higher than the others, and it was not possible to have to be real. But then, because the commission, the previous commission, Electoral Commission, had representatives of the parties, the same political deal that parties would cut outside the commission or in parliament or in closed doors, it would be reflected on the cooking of the results by the commission, by the party representatives in the commission. This time around, it was a different deal. By all accounts and observers and various people like us whom we never believed that a good election can take place, the last election was better than all its previous ones. And it is regarded to be, but the ball was in the yard of the political parties, understanding the new system, how to run your candidates in this, and how to work in a way to concentrate the votes for given candidates that you definitely want them to win. We went to the elections with that setup, and at the same time as preparations were being made for the election, people were generally worried about 2 issues. Issue number 1 was the militias in the center and south, and there were forces, political parties still had members or armed groups that were killing activists, kidnapping them, blackmailing them, threatening independent candidates. So the atmosphere for campaigning wasn't perfect. And luckily, with the new setup in Iraq and with the large number of internet penetration and internet points in the country, I would say social media played a big role in the campaigning. And it did not require many candidates to go on the street and talk to the people and shake hands with people and endanger their physical security. We had cases of, for example, in, I think, Najaf, some teacher, some older teacher, who ran a very simple campaign. And he used Facebook as well. Again, the Facebook use of him was mostly his students, because he was he comes from an older generation who's not very much internet savvy, social media savvy, and he won. He got into parliament as an independent candidate. He got the right votes in that constituency where he had. So we had situations like this. The difficulties or the fear of Iranian influence and intervention in the electoral affairs were very much there and present. But it seems that the Iranians trusted too much their forces, the militias and the political parties that they were on the ground, thinking that they will manage by themselves. So now we realize there wasn't that much of an intervention. They left it for the ground, for the people on the ground. And so we went to the election, and a huge surprise, relatively speaking, to everybody. Still, with that surprise, we've seen many changes in the seat numbers, seat allocations, especially in the Shia scene and with the Sunnis as well. The Sunnis were concentrated into two main blocks, one of them called Taqaddum, by the Speaker of Parliament, led by the Speaker of Parliament, Muhammad al-Halbusi. He had something like 43. Again, the numbers are still not final. The commission finished all its initial results, handed over everything to the highest court in land, the Constitutional Court, for it to approve. Now we are hearing they are looking at various complaints by some candidates who didn't win, and they could be bringing back, or we might see some change of seats. But the changes are not dramatic. Something like if you have 70, then by order of the court, you go down to 40. If you have 70, you may get 69 or 68 or 71 or 72. These are the changes that we are expecting to happen. Two main surprises. One was that the Sadrist bloc amongst the Shiites got an extremely high number compared to previous years, to previous elections. They have over 70 seats. In the last one, they were, I think, 45. Some of them got almost zero, like the former Prime Minister, Haidar al-Abadi. He has two seats. In the last election, he had 25 seats. Then we have people like al-Maliki, former Prime Minister. Again, he had some higher number of seats than the previous one. And but he is still not happy as being part of the opposition to Sadr camp, the Shia opposition to Muqtada al-Sadr. The biggest blow to a group was the Al-Fatah group. Al-Fatah group, this is the one head by a guy called Hadi al-Amiri. He's head of a militia himself. And the groups that are mostly seen as troublemaking militias, and they are pro-Iran, are mostly in that alliance. Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, Kata'ib Hezbollah, other groups, other smaller groups. They are small in number but very well equipped in arms, and they are the ones, every time it is different. They are the ones who killed the protesters. They are the ones who kidnap protesters. They are the ones who receive money and funds, and they have Iranian political cover. And they are the ones who are firing all these Katyusha missiles on the embassies. And they are the ones who hit the Erbil airport every now and then, saying that there are Americans there. So they are the ones who are holding the slogan of resistance to the occupation, the American occupation as they describe it. And, but this time they had very few votes. The reason for that major decline, they were 45, again around 45 or 47, depending on who's in and who's out at the time, seats in the previous parliament. This time they have around 15. There are two reasons for this. One reason is that the popular sentiment was very much anti-Iran, and they didn't vote for them because of the Iranians' connection. That's one. Secondly, within this group, they had various candidates. Because it's an alliance of more than 3 or 4 parties, almost each group had a candidate in every constituency. So you would go to constituency 1 or A in Baghdad, and you would see one from Asaib, one from Kataib, one from Badr, one from another group, one independent amongst them in that list. So they got votes, but the votes were distributed amongst them in a way that none of them was able to get enough seats to make it to parliament. Had they decided on running with one candidate, maybe they could have had a better chance in these areas. But these two elements together pushed them into that corner, and now they are the main group that are conducting many demonstrations outside the green zone. They are also suspected, although most of them said that they have not done it and they condemned the attack, but they are also suspected. One of these groups is suspected of conducting the drone attack on the house of the Prime Minister, the existing Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi. And we are still waiting to see. Traditionally, and for the Kurds, the KDP got the highest of the votes, Kurdistan Democratic Party. This is the party led by Masoud Barzani, former president of the region, and known to be a legendary leader amongst them. And he's quite historical in terms of political legacy. It used to be Barzani and Talabani. Talabani is no more around. He died a few years ago. Now it's Barzani who's seen as that rank of the leaders who still enjoys some political status. The other political party, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, Talabani's party, didn't do that well. They have 15 seats. Again, it could become one more or one less depending on the court ruling, what we will see. But both parties control areas in Iraqi Kurdistan. They control the land. So it is very difficult to have them outside of government because they're practically areas under their control. You cannot have them outside of government process. The same thing with the smaller group of Hashd, the 15 number, the 15 candidate group. They have the weapons, they have the militias, and during the day they are under the banner of the PMF. At night they become resistance and they conduct all these attacks that undermine the Iraqi state. And they are the more thinking about that is that they should be contained and not left into opposition. It will be very difficult to have an opposition group with an armed faction, and this is not just one. These people, they together form the PMF, Popular Mobilization Force, or known locally as Al-Hashd Al-Shabi. They were established during the war against ISIS to combat ISIS. They're mostly Shia and of the Shia sect, and it was very much used, that occasion, that opportunity was very much used by these groups to strengthen themselves. Now their budget is something around $2.6 billion. They are a paramilitary group. They run parallel to the state. They say we are under the control of the commander-in-chief, which is the prime minister, but in reality they don't listen to, they don't take his orders. They have their own structures and setup. Even when the prime minister goes to visit them, he doesn't go there as the commander-in-chief. He goes there as a visitor to the bases, to the compounds. It is well reported by sources from inside and by journalists that most of the sophisticated weapons that the Iraqi state has received from various countries is now in the possession of these groups. And it is not, the Iraqi army does not have the power to control these weapons from them. So moving ahead with government formation, with this kind of complex and new architecture that we are seeing, moving ahead with that, we have various options, or two main options. Right now, as we speak, the ball is in the Shia political forces yard. They have to decide how to move forward. Currently, we have three main groups. The Sadr, which is considered the Sadr group, who is considered the winner in the election amongst the Shiites. He has over 70 seats. Maliki, who has around 40 seats, or just over 35 seats, who is the arch enemy of Sadr. The two of them, everyone expects that it is impossible for them to be in one government or in one building, let alone government. And then you have the smaller group of Fatah that is armed, that are the ones who are conducting all the protests, and they have the loudest voice. They are almost in the middle, although Maliki and this smaller group are now seen to be part of one alliance. But in reality, it is not impossible to bring those 15 people or that group into government, because it just makes sense to bring the armed opposition into armed groups into the fold and maybe try to control them from within. This is on one hand. Historically speaking, in previous elections, the Shiite agreed between themselves on who is the biggest bloc and which bloc names the prime minister, and then the Kurds and the Sunnis joined afterwards. This time round, we have to still wait to see what the court is going to say. With every year in the past, the constitutional court would have to explain what does the biggest bloc mean. The Iraqi constitution says the biggest bloc names the prime minister. To this day, we are not very clear on who the biggest bloc is. Is it the biggest electoral bloc? That means the bloc that won the election and came as, like, for example, today Sadr or Maliki or the others? Or is it the biggest parliamentary bloc, which means an alliance after the election? When they all go into parliament, they form a new bloc, and that bloc in numbers could be seen as the largest, and then they name the prime minister. This hasn't gone to court yet, and I think we still have some time to go. I remember in, was it September? In September, Thomas contacted me saying, let's come in October, sometime late October, to talk about the government formation. And I said it will be way too early. Let's at least give it a month. But this is what, a month and 10 days. And it is still too early to talk about the how will the situation move forward.
So you will have to come in the spring again? Possibly,
and then tell you about the ministries. Yes, that's not unrealistic, to be honest, if we talk about the spring, because now the court has responded. And then they're asking for some more questions from the commission. And with every time the question goes back at the commission, the Electoral Commission answers the question, it will reset the clock for declaring the final results. And each reset is 20 days and 20 days. So we are looking at the beginning of next year. Iran would like to have these groups talk or have to talk about it, but one suspicion, one possibility is that the Americans have said in the past that they will end their combat presence in Iraq by the end of December. And so practically American presence in Iraq could end by end of December, although they will change the role of somebody, but politically Iraqis will have less American presence after December. This is the Iranian thinking, and it is possible that the Iranians would like to see government negotiations practically taking place after the change of Americans' presence inside Iraq, from combat forces into training and advice. This is what I have to say. I think, I'm hoping that I didn't, yes, that's just under 40 minutes. And thank you for listening. And I hope to discuss whatever I missed in the questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiva, for your interesting opening statement. As I'm the moderator, I will steal the first two questions, and after that we will give space to you. You mentioned the role of Marja'iyya, and we all know that Marja'iyya carries a huge weight in Iraqi politics, not only in Shia politics, but in Iraqi politics in general. Marja'iyya, for example, even intervened prior to elections saying to people, you should go and vote, right? What is the role of Marja'iyya now in this process, and what should we expect from Marja'iyya to support, back, advise? Are they going to engage in some mediations, or are they doing it at the moment?
Thank you. Very interesting questions. Are we on Chatham House rules, or are we? Is this public?
This is public. Chatham House rules will be tomorrow.
Okay. Well, let me rephrase my answers then. Marja'iyya has an important role, or had always an important role to play in keeping peace, unlike what some from the Sunni camp think. I think Marja'iyya played a great role. Marja'iyya, for those, I don't need to explain Marja'iyya, right? No. It's close. It's Grand Ayatollah Sistani and his role. He's seen as the highest Shia authority. He had a great role in minimizing the damage of the Sunni-Shia conflict in 2007, 8, and 9, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, all these tough years. This is one. Secondly, when ISIS attacked and took over Mosul and was coming towards Baghdad, the Iraqi army practically collapsed. They just walked to these towns, ISIS. They didn't have even to fight. One friend from Tikrit tells me that 4 cars of ISIS, with their flashlights and with their car horns, they took Tikrit. They didn't need even to fire a bullet. So everything had collapsed. The rest of the country was under the threat of being collapsed until Marja'iyya came up with a fatwa that recruited a lot of people, young Shiites mostly, to join the new formation, which is today gradually becoming a problem for the state, the Hashid group. This is on one hand. Because of the behavior of Hashid, the Marja'iyya's creation, let's say, and the Iranians' use of that body, Marja'iyya's role declined up to a point in terms of its popular support. Two examples we have. Example number one is that they continue to be asked about the future of Hashd. What happens to it now? Now that ISIS is over, this militia force that was formed to fight ISIS is no longer needed. To this day, they do not talk much about what should happen to that group. They do not dare, almost, because of the strong Iranian influence. That's on one hand. On the other hand, in the run-up to the election, Marja'iyya asked everybody to go and vote. And if it was 2006, 7 or 8, or if it was 2010, we would see a very large turnout. This time, the actual voter turnout was 19%, 19. The commission talked about 43% turnout, but this 43% is out of the registered voters. In Iraq, you cannot, I don't know if it's the same in the Czech Republic, you cannot go to elections if you do not register as a voter. And your registry gives you a voter card with your biometric data. 70% of Iraqis registered, and of the 70%, 43% went and voted. But if you take the ratio of people who went out and voted for the total eligible population was 19%. And this is after expecting a much higher turnout during, as a result of the Marja'iyya call for people. This is one. The second thing, nearly 1.3 million votes of the people went to people who are not religious, of the Shia population, to people who are not religious and are secular and are away, and they do not believe in all the religious values. They are anti-Islamist or religious parties. So these are some indicators that say the role of the Marja'iyya isn't as powerful as it used to be in the past. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much. I think I will have just one quick question for myself. You mentioned, that's probably a big question to answer, but you were mentioning Hashd al-Shabi, the Popular Mobilization Forces, aka the militias that we all hear about in the media and closely follow. And we know that they play a prominent role even in Sunni areas, majority Sunni areas, where they essentially have a strong presence. In some areas they just run the show, so to say. How does it fly with the Sunnis, and did it affect the voting behaviors of Sunnis in any way?
PMF presence in Sunni areas is one of the key issues that is creating this image or this portraying this reputation of PMF. PMF initially was established to fight ISIS. ISIS was over thanks to the Allies, Air Force, and to all Iraqis, really, the army, the Peshmerga forces, and members of the Hashd. They took over these areas back from ISIS. But what we noticed, even within the PMF, there are various formations. There are some are called Hashd al-Atabat. These are the forces that belonged to the holy shrines of Najaf and Karbala. In these places, people who reported to the managers of these shrines were also a force that was used. But that force fought at the beginning And then soon after the war was over, they were very quick to provide services and humanitarian assistance to the disastered areas. But what we saw from the other groups, the pro-Iranian militias, they stayed in some of these areas and they established small fiefdoms. So you would find a local Hashid commander in an area of Mosul becoming the ruler of that place, charging people for taxes or levies, arresting people, releasing people, banning certain activities during the month of Muharram, for example. The Shia, and trying to establish, to enforce a Shia style of, a Shia way of life in areas that are otherwise Sunni. They don't have much of a connection. So it is highly expected that that behavior could lead the next generation of Sunnis to reject the PMF in a way that it make it not impossible for them to support a re-emergence of something like ISIS, not necessarily ISIS. Any opposition to those. This is the scene today in the Sunni areas reminds us a lot of the scene in the Sunni areas just before ISIS came and took over. Maliki had an extremely sectarian army, sectarian groups, very Shiite, very adamant to be to inflict or to impose Shia way of life on Sunni areas. And as a result, when ISIS came, if you guys remember the first footage of ISIS coming to the area, people welcomed them because said that we just finished from the Shia rule. We could be facing the same situation if the PMF does not either reform or be reformed.
Thank you, Hiva. And now questions from the audience, please. Yes.
Hello, good evening, Mr. Osman. My name is Wojciech Bile. I'm one of the researchers here at Prague Center for Middle East Relations. You have mentioned that these elections were unexpectedly good or better than the previous ones. On the other hand, you also mentioned that we still have this issue of the militia groups or even Al-Fatah having some close relations to Iranian government, that these groups might possess some weapons and arms that are not in control of the government, and hence they have some sort of power, I would assume. You also mentioned the case of the United States Army being present in the territory, and that might represent some sort of temporary issue, and that with the departure, this might be possible to overcome. So my question is quite simple. To what extent you would say that the elections were under some influences of any foreign countries, direct or indirect, and it doesn't have to be restrained just to the US or Iran?
To what extent what was under
the elections itself, you know, to what extent you would say that there was some sort of influence or interference of foreign countries to these elections?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we will take, let's say, two more questions.
Yeah.
Is there a question? Anybody?
It's very clear what I said, it seems.
Right. Okay, so I will ask one more question. What actually surprised me when I looked at the results of the Sunni house, of the Sunni political blocs, was more consolidation. And I also saw that, let's say, the old-timers or the previous generation, speaking, for example, about the Nujaifi family in Mosul, they lost a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, almost everything when it comes to the seats and the levies, the leverage they had. Why do you explain that? Why did this happen? Is it some kind of significant political transformation within the Sunni electorate, or is just new leaders that are doing it well, convincing people?
Thank you. No more?
One more question?
That's fine.
All right.
I'll talk and then we'll see. Elections were under foreign interference. It was very difficult this time to, even if you were an outside force, to interfere in the elections this time, because for two simple practical reasons. One, you had 83 constituencies. So you needed, in order to interfere, if you are a foreign power, you wanted to interfere in the elections for a party, you needed to have 43 operations, or 45 or 50 local operations in order to interfere, in order to be able to support one side or the other. That was very difficult. The interference that might have happened was that political parties receiving maybe funding from outsiders and leaving it for them to run their own campaigns. And they clearly failed, some of them. Quite a lot of them who were suspected. Again, it's very difficult to establish who received and who did not receive funding from the outside. But usually and historically, those who receive funding from the outside in a blatant way, they fail. A very clear example, I remember a guy called Ayad Jamaluddin in 2006. He spent over $10 million or something like this on his campaign. And this was at a time when the whole of the country was one constituency. And he didn't get a single seat in the election. So interfering in the Iraq election per se to manage to influence voters can be quite difficult. So one was the cutting up of the country into 83 smaller constituencies. Two, believe it or not, Facebook had transparency measures for the first time in Iraq, for the Iraq elections, for the first time in the Arab world, and they applied it for the first time in Iraq. So if you were to have to pay for your advertising on Facebook, Facebook would tell the public how much you spent, and that could go against you in an election. The third element was that the machines used was extremely difficult to play with the system, starting from biometric registration to taking your fingerprint before you vote and getting the ballot paper. When you get the ballot paper, after taking your fingerprint, the barcode or the QR code on the ballot paper had to be read by the machine. That machine then sends that code to the voting box. And when you scan your paper to go into the ballot box, if the paper didn't have a QR code that is connected to a fingerprint, the machine would have rejected it. So it was a very complicated and lengthy procedure. And the way it was done this time, previously in the 2018 election, we had the same company called, Korean company called Miru, M-I-R-U. And there were many questions about the security, the digital security of these machines back then. And some people managed to play with them. This time around, the commission, the new commission, hired a German security auditing company, independent, totally independent. They looked at the machines and they gave their recommendations, and they provided not just feedback, but they provided ways of making them even more secure that the Iraqis implemented. So the auditing of the machines and the integrity of the voting system was quite well kept throughout. If there is tampering with any machine, it would just stop working. And we've seen that on many occasions, even sometimes very famous figures like political party leaders. They would go, sometimes in some cities you have the VIP voting station, but then you have the local stations. Some party leaders went to the VIP in order to pose for the media, and they tried to vote. The machine didn't accept their vote, didn't accept their fingers because they were not there registered. They had to go to the local school. Their fingerprints were in that local school, and then they had to vote there. So again, it wasn't very easy to interfere, to play with it this time like the previous ones. Sunnis consolidated into two main groups, yes, they were. Two reasons. One was that those who lost the historical faces, some people like Nujafi family or some other famous Sunni personalities, were seen as part of the failed past. And people just had enough of them, really. I mean, that was the only, talking to people, why didn't you vote for somebody like Nujafi? They said we wanted to try something new. Plus, the Nujafis and the other older Sunni personalities did not have political parties as such to campaign for them. Halbusi doesn't also have political party, but he had a big operation of, he was Speaker of Parliament, and he managed to build a network of assets of people in the area of where he ran. And his father is a tribal chief. Most of the campaigning in the Anbar province was done by Halbusi's father for him. So he left Anbar for his father. He did it well. He went to Salah ad-Din himself and to Mosul to conduct campaigning. The new guys won, yes, both Khanjar or Azm and Taqaddum, both of them have connections to Turkey. And they seem to have received some tip-offs, and they did a better campaign. And they planned better for the new system. The KDP, for example, in the Kurdish scene, they had a better plan than the other parties. Or the bigger surprise amongst the Kurds was the new generation. A new party, they managed to get 9 seats. Again, the way they did it, in each constituency, they just had one candidate, and they had a logo. So they told the people, just vote for that logo. Don't worry about name, people, platform, or whatever. Just stamp the logo, and it will work. And this is what people did, and they managed to get 9 out of 14. They only had 14 candidates. 9 of them won.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience? Oh, no worries. I still have enough in my sleeves. What we haven't covered yet, actually, is the Tishrin parties, the political actors that came outside from the protest movement that rocked Iraq since October 2019. So if you could elaborate on their success and also on the success of independence, which was quite surprising, and whether these new actors can be a formidable force in the new parliament. What is going to be their role?
Those who ran, those protesters or the leading protesters, let's put it this way. In the run-up to the elections, the protesters split into 2 camps. Some said we shouldn't run in the election and we should continue protesting. and act as a pressure force on the whole political establishment to make them better. They said, few months of protest, we forced them to change the law, to change the commission, to change, but it wasn't just few months of protest. It was 700 people killed and 23,000 people injured. And with that, they were forced to do many changes. They changed the government initially, they changed the law, they changed the electoral system and the commission. This is on one side. That was, one camp said we shouldn't run in the election and we should continue acting as a pressure group. The other camp was like, no, we should run in the election and we have enough support because of all the sacrifices that was made and the impact that we made during the election, during the protests. We could have votes. Both were right, I presume. Those who ran in the election managed to get some seats. They are known as Imtidad movement in the south. Their main leader is a doctor by the name of Ala al-Rikabi. He was one of the key protest leaders on the street in Nasiriyah, and he formed a list and he ran and he got seats in other areas, other governorates of the country. Together they make around 9. There are some independents. So we had the blocks of the protesters. At the same time, we also had a number of independent candidates in various parts, in various constituencies. Those two, they won some seats. But with the independents, there is a competition between the October protesters and the political parties, the established political parties, Shia, Sunni, Kurd. They want to take them to their side. They are expected to be split into almost half. Some would go with the independent, with the protesters, and some would join the governing parties or the political elite. Looking ahead, this bloc, they announced from the beginning that they will not take part in government formation, and they will, their natural place is parliament. They are expected to be a strong or at least a very loud opposition, very effective opposition, because they will not have people in government. The Kurds, the Kurdish independents or the new generation also have the same position. They announced that they will not enter the government and they will choose the opposition side. So between them, if there is coordination, they could have a very vibrant or effective opposition. And they break the parliamentary tradition in Iraq of everyone in parliament, almost everybody in parliament also has a seat in government. Because previously we had governments whereby all parties took part in. So you have a bloc in parliament, and based on the size of your bloc, you get a size or a share in the government formation. So parliament in practice lost its role as a body that should oversee the work of government, that should hold the government accountable, and questioning ministers became also hostage to the relations between the various political parties. For example, former finance minister and foreign minister, Hoshyar Zebari, was questioned in parliament and was expelled from his, they passed a vote of no confidence in him as a minister of finance. On the outside, it looked very well and fine, you know, parliament questioning a minister and then passing a vote of no confidence. But the reality, the story behind this story was that Maliki's, Prime Minister Maliki back then, His party didn't go on well with they had problems with the KDP, and as their way to get back at the KDP, they brought his minister to parliament and did that with him. This time round, if we have a good independent or a good opposition in parliament that doesn't have ministers in government, the role of parliament as a supervisor, as somebody that holds as a watchdog on the government, could be redefined or could be done for the first time since its establishment.
Thank you. Do we have some questions from the audience? Anyone? I can continue, but I mean, it's a pity to pass on this opportunity, you know? Yes?
Mr. Osman, I have one rather more of a personal question. Answer to your possibilities and to how you feel comfortable to answering. But what are your hopes for the new government? Your personal hopes for the new upcoming government, which is not formed yet, but like, what are your best hopes and expectations?
Sorry, I think the mask is blocking.
Okay, I'll try without a mask if you allow me.
I think without the mask.
Okay, I'll start again with the question. My apologies. My question would be a little bit more personal. Answer if you wish, but again, like up to you. What are your hopes? What are your expectations from the new government? Like, what do you expect most at the moment? I know that we don't have the government yet, but like, where you wish that the government would take it to? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we take one more? Maybe I have one question that is actually going back to the context of elections and what happened before that. So we saw for the first time protests and discontent and disagreement in the center and the south among Shia. How come, considering that arguably even the Sunni areas and to some extent even the Kurdish areas could use the same arguments and could protest as well? How come this protest movement was just limited essentially to one sect, we may say?
Thank you. Good question. My hopes, personal hopes for the new government, let's see who will form the government. But any government that comes to power really cannot continue or cannot do more of the same. Neither of the previous governments, nor like this government, the guy who's in power now, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, he's a nice guy. He goes to Washington, to DC, and tells them whatever they want to hear. He goes to Tehran and tells them whatever they want to hear. He goes to the Kurds and tells them whatever they want to hear. And he is trying to keep everyone afloat by keeping himself afloat, to stay afloat by keeping everyone happy. And that's why the result now, we have some blocks, somebody like Maliki or even some of the others, are saying anything but Kadhimi. I think the breakthrough for any government, for the future, any future government, is to finish with this ethno-sectarian quota system, muhassasa, what they call muhassasa, i.e. Kurds get this much, Shiites get this much, and Sunnis get this much. And if you have a minister there, basically because he's from this party, he's untouchable, or because he's from the other party. That's the biggest problem. And for as long as we have this system, this unspoken rule of each sect takes something, a share of the pie. For example, president has to be Kurdish, prime minister has to be Shia, Speaker of Parliament has to be Sunni. There is nothing in the Constitution that says that, but it has been the convention. And then you move down. to the second tier and the same layer, all the layers all the way down. It was the recipe for Iraq being the second most corrupt systems of governance in the world. Every year with Transparency International, World Bank, UN, you name it, all these various indexes, Iraq is listed as one of the most corrupt governments, and despite all the promises and all the measures, nobody is able to do anything. Nobody has managed to do anything. They may arrest a small director here or there, but the big fish are still out there. Nobody can touch them. They are the untouchables, as I wrote about them in a previous article. The protests, why are they in the center and the south? Why are they in the Shia areas and not in the Sunni and Kurdish areas? Because the government is mostly Shia, as I said in the beginning of my presentation. If you are to protest against that government, if you are a Sunni, you're immediately labeled as ISIS. And this happened in the past. The Sunni areas, 2011, 10, they had big protests against the government in the Sunni areas. And Maliki was very quick to label them as ISIS or Al-Qaeda back then. And he said these guys are Al-Qaeda and the Ba'ath Party or Saddam's people, and they shouldn't be taking part. In Kurdistan, the situation is a bit different. Because there is a local government, the problems that exist are dealt with at a local level. So we had protests in Kurdistan on 2 occasions, and in both occasions they manifested into failed political parties, practically speaking. In 2011, 2011, we had protests, very strong protests, in Suleymaniye mostly, but they were translated into a political party called the Change Movement. That political party got 25% of the seats in parliament, got into government. This election, the one we just had, they had 0 seats. They were just like a big bubble. Finished. The new movement called the New Generation, we see them as very active, but again, mostly Suleymaniye based. And they still lack the political platform. They're quite populist in their outlook. So protests in the Kurdistan region, it's very difficult to connect them to the rest of the situation in the country. At one point, I remember there was either the anniversary of the protests in Baghdad or the whole country, and they called for protests throughout the country to take place. They tried so much with the Kurds to also protest on that day, nobody got out of their houses. But on other occasions, they managed to be out on the streets protesting for their rights.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we will have one last question, if there will be any. Yes.
Very short, I don't need any microphone.
No, we need it for the recording. We need.
For recording?
Yes.
You will record me? This is a police regime here. Okay, excuse me. My name is Paul Fisk. Temporary unemployed because of the virus. Not important. Difficult for me to ask anything because I visited Iraq 1 year after the Desert Storm.
Okay.
And I visited for 2 weeks Saudi Arabia, twice Syria, etc. And then you spoke about many problems, but maybe I didn't hear properly. I haven't heard anything about the relations between Persia. I don't dare to say Iran, because Iran is awful. I visited Iran for 2 weeks ago, again, later. And therefore, because I had many students, except my principal job, I'm construction economist, and except I deliver lectures for foreign students at the Technical University here in Prague. Therefore, in these hands, I had many Arab students. Therefore, I'm interested in these problems there. And the principal problem, if you don't mind it, Iraq and Syria, except Saudi Arabia, and artificial states. 1923, artificial on the map, artificial borders. This is, if you compare it with the Czechia, Gumuria Czechia, Czech kingdom started in 12th century, and up to now in the same borders. Therefore, no problems with minorities, except Germans, they are here. And maybe you haven't heard anything about the history here.
So what's the question? What's the question?
The question is the relations between Iran and Iraq. Because I remember very good the war, 7 years or how many years did it last? Because I know it through my students. I had students from both sides. And then tell me, how do you see the future? Because Iran is very aggressive. Do you agree with me or not?
Okay. So the future.
So
the future of Iraq-Iran relations.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Anyone?
Anyone else? Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. My name is Aram, and I would like to ask...
Can you take off your mask,
Yeah,
please?
for sure.
Yeah, so we can hear it better.
I would like to ask if the upcoming Kurdistan region will be the same voting system as the one held in Iraq, and if it will be as transparent as the last elections of Iraq. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Okay. Iran-Iraq relations. Two countries that have always lived next to each other. Let me tell you a little story. Once, when I was with President Talabani, and he was speaking in some forum, political forum, with various people in it, allies, East, West, Turks, Arabs, Iranians, and everything else. And throughout his speech, he kept saying, referring to the regional dynamics and international dynamics in in Iraq, saying our Iranian brothers, our Iranian brothers, our Syrian brothers, our Syrian brothers, our Turkish brothers, our Saudi brothers. And then when it came to talk about the Americans and the Brits and the French who were active helpers, said the American friends, the British friends, American friends, British friends. And somebody asked him, he said, could you explain to us why do you label Iran as your brother? And this is a country, and Syria, and and Turkey, and these are countries that you're having a lot of problems from. And then people who paid lives to come and liberate you, you say we are friends. He said, his answer was, you are obliging me to reveal a big national security secret, an Iraqi one. He said, a friend is somebody who you choose. A brother is somebody who's imposed on you, and you're stuck with him for the rest of your life. So our relationship with the Iranians They are there. Neither us nor they can disappear. We would have liked to be in an island somewhere in the ocean, but the reality is not. And relationships between Iran and Iraq has never been based on equality, on something that both sides saw themselves. It was either a dispute for over 40, 50 years over borders on the south. Then Saddam came and destroyed that treaty. They agree at the expense of a minority of the Kurds, Iran and Iraq, and that the agreement is destroyed. They get into an 8-year war. Then afterwards they have another, but it was never a normal, I would say, relationship between the two sides. It was always, Iran always sees itself as the state that has thousands of years of history, and sees Iraq, as you just mentioned, an artificial country that should be following Iran. That attitude towards Iraq has never changed from the days of the Shah and to the days of Ayatollahs. Today, the Ayatollahs, you speak to them without a camera and say, "What is Iraq for you?" He says, "It's my backyard. I do whatever I want from there, and they should all be with me, not with the Americans." And they have this superior relationship. And as a result of that superior relationship that they have, the protesters said Iran barra barra in the protests. Maybe this time with this election, they get the message that, look, you cannot treat Iraq the way Syria used to treat Lebanon, or the way the former Soviet Union used to treat these Eastern blocs as extensions to it. This is how Iran sees Iraq, and this will never change until they come to a change of mindset. Iraqi Kurdistan region, and will we have a transparent election like this one or not? Iraqi Kurdistan region also suffers from a lot of problems. Governance issues, corruption, nepotism, and favoritism, you name it. That's why we are seeing hundreds of young people on the borders of Belarus and Poland who are trying to run away from that to find, in search of better life. It's something that we cannot really shy away from or hide away from or run away from. Will it be a transparent election? Provided what I heard today, I don't think so. Today, just before I come here, I was looking at the news. The Kurdistan Parliament was looking at a new election commission, forming a new election commission. And the way they wanted to form it was to have representatives of the political parties that are ruling to be in that commission. This is a recipe for disaster, I think. If they want an election that looks like the Iraqi one, they should have truly independent professional people. And there are enough independent professional people in Kurdistan, but they do not belong to the parties. That's why they do not receive preferential treatment. Thank you so much. I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Hiva, and thank you for questions from the audience that came towards the end, so I didn't carry all the weight. Thank you very much for all of you for coming during these difficult COVID times and increased cases. And I hope we will see each other next time, still on site. As a matter of fact, we will have another event just in 2 weeks. That's gonna be with a professor from Mali, Professor Ali Tunkara, and he's going to be talking about developments in Sahel, in Mali, and the rise of Islamist groups. So it should be another engaging debate, provided we do not have to cancel it, considering COVID. But again, thank you very much for coming, and goodbye.
Thank you.